This is one family's experience, and as Ching says, it's quite different people. But what you should realize is that this is one of 300 million such stories. The stories may be different, but there's 300 million of them. That's what the Chinese government is now saying, that the one-child policy has averted 300 million births in China, that their population, instead of being 1.3 billion now, would be 1.6 billion. And that 300 million people is the total population of the United States. So China has, as they perceive it, as they claim, averted putting another United States worth of population into the world. And that's the significance of spending 2 full lectures on China, and we could, of course, spend a lot more, is that China is just so big that everything that happens there has these tremendous significances, both on an individual personal level for each individual or family that experiences it, but also on the global level. 1 out of every 5 human beings lives in China, so it is very big. We'll talk in a later lecture explicitly about the one-child policy, but there's information I have to give you today to understand what it's about. But let me just say now that the Chinese government is, of course, well aware of the human and human rights sacrifices of the individual people, but they argue that the benefits outweigh the suffering. And so just to give you a little hint of the way the government thinks about it, and many other people in China, that the great economic boom that China has had, most economists now around the world attribute the kickoff of that to the reduction in fertility, that they didn't have to cope with so many children, and that's a cause of their economy taking off. So they perceive that the one-child policy has allowed China to emerge from this grinding poverty that they were in and become a modern, at least start to become a modern nation in the world. Another story, another data set that I just recently came across had to do with carbon emissions. That at a world average of carbon usage, which is probably below what China's actually using, 300 extra million people would have produced 1.5 billion, that's a billion with a B, billion tons of CO2 each year. And that's more than the total CO2 production of an industrial giant like Germany. So if you're looking at this issue from an environmental point of view, the reduction of people and their environmental impact makes, again, a huge difference. And the Chinese, for instance, feel that because of the one-child policy alone, they have done more than any other country to ameliorate the environmental crisis. Okay, that's just a hint of the very difficult things. How do you weigh the story of a family and 300 million families, like you've just heard, against these sort of macro issues? And it is not easy. So, but the question I want to set up today, which is to go backwards, is this kind of policy happens only in China. This kind of enormous population, as the Chinese perceive it, overpopulation, happens in China, really, and in India in terms of massive stuff. And we've talked a little about India and South Asia. But the question is, what's special about China? Why did this happen in China? Why did, as they perceive it, population got so out of control that the government felt that they had to introduce such a draconian policy as this, such a stringent kind of policy? And the flip side of that coin is, why is China just now digging out from the abject poverty that the people were in when Europe and America dug out 200 years ago? I mean, England started, but all of Europe and America went through this phase 200 years ago. And why not China? Of course, this is a very, very hotly contested issue among historians. And the basic setup of the story is that in about 1800, when Malthus was writing, China was very powerful, very strong, very rich country, and the West was beginning to be that way. The Industrial Revolution was just starting in England. And you would have seen enormous differences between China and, say, England or Europe in 1800, but you would not have been able to predict which model was going to take over the world, which country was going to become bigger and stronger in the future. China was a very impressive place in 1800, and Europe was beginning to be a very impressive place in 1800. And then I may go into a little bit the history a little bit more, but by 1840, when the British invaded, with the Opium War, the British started to addict the Chinese to opium. The Chinese government said no. The British tried free trade and invaded to force China to accept British opium, which they got of India. Okay, that's a separate story which we may or may not have time for. But then, so in a very short period of time, China goes from being one of the dominant countries in the world to being sort of the pawn in the world, that the British start colonizing it, the Germans start colonizing it, the Americans take advantage. Everybody starts taking advantage of China, starts the colonization of China, starts the dismembering of China. And why did this happen is one of the major issues in world history. And there's many, many different points of view on this. There's 10 major theories or something. And in this class, I just have to unwind one thread, one version of the story and only one thread of that story. And that's the relationship between the population of China, the wealth of China, and the poverty of China. This particular thread about population was obvious to Europeans visiting China even in the European Middle Ages. And you know, Marco Polo visited China in the 1200s, and he described China's cultivation, how every little bit of land was under very intense cultivation already. Populousness, that the population was already incredibly dense as viewed through European eyes of the same time. And industry, the people worked very hard, and whatever they did, they were very productive at it. So, and he, you know, the stories of Kublai Khan and all that were from Marco Polo, that he sort of idolized China as this incredibly rich, but very, very crowded place. Adam Smith in the 17th century, the guy who started modern economics, said, China has long been one of the richest, most fertile, best cultivated, and most industrious and most populous countries in the world. So Adam Smith was aware of it. And all of these great scholars of the late 1700s were looking around the world. Finally, there was enough seafaringness, they could go around the world and compare different things and try to figure out what was the best system for people to live under. A few years after Adam Smith, Malthus writes, and he quotes the information that Europeans were getting were mostly from Jesuit priests who had gone over to China to try to convert the population. And he quotes one rather well-known Jesuit priest then, China is, quote, the richest and most flourishing empire in the world. But, the priest goes on, because of overpopulation, the people are, quote, the poorest and most miserable of all. And so right from way, way back, people are aware that China was basically a very rich country, but because of the huge population, the individual families were often in abject poverty. While if you looked at the emperor and the nobles, of course, they had enormous wealth. These early observers were certainly correct about the population issue there. So we have data from, say, 1750, and China had 500 people per cultivated square kilometer. At the same time, Europe had about 70 people for the square kilometer. So China had to, on the same farmland, had to support 7 times as many people. And of course, numbers from 1750 don't take that as any kind of an exact number. Up to today, China has something like 20% of the world's population. Because of the one-child policy, the ratio was higher. They had more than 20%. But now it's down to about 20% because India is still coming up. A lot of the world is still coming up, and China population is still increasing, but increasing at a rather slow rate. It has now 20% of the world's population, but only 6 to 7% of the arable land, the farmable land in the world. The amount of farmland per person is 0.2 acres per person, 10 times less than the United States has. So there's a real problem with China's population, and the question is why did China's population press up against the resources and riches of the land so much more so than in, say, Europe? For most of history, China's population does not look terribly different. We got the clicker, it's up here. Hang on, anyway, you can see this, that in the Han Dynasty, which was the first unifying dynasty of China, very much the same time as the Roman Empire, it had a population of 50, 60 million. Then according to this reconstruction of China's history, and all these reconstructions are very iffy, you notice population stays stable for 1,000 years. Then during the Song Dynasty, which is one of the very most important dynasties in China, very successful, population rises and then it falls back down again. The Yuan, which is the Mongol invasions, this decline probably is very much characterized by the Mongol invasions. The particular dates here are dates when we have censuses, when the various emperors took censuses. And in between, you really don't know what's happening, and you're also not sure how complete these censuses are. But anyway, the Mongol invasion, then it stays constant, and then sometime in this period, probably there's no census really, they don't have any data between 1400 and 1750, so this curve in here is kind of guesswork. But sometime in the 1700s, as in Europe, the population takes off. Something like this doesn't look wildly in shape. In magnitude it's different, but in shape it doesn't look very different than Europe. In the Han Dynasty, 60 million Chinese. 1,400 years later, in 1393, they counted 60.5 million people. And in between, the population went as low as 37 million. And then, as I said, the Mongol invasions decimated the population, and then just before the European Black Death, but a decimation in the same sense as the European Black Death. And then it took a long time for China's population to come back up. By the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, one of the also very flourishing periods in Chinese history, China had maybe 75 million people, up from 60 million. And then it starts doubling. In the next 200 years, it doubles and continues on up. As in Europe, there were major epidemics. In the 1640s, there was some major epidemic that we can liken to plague, but people really don't know what kind of a disease it was. And a Chinese scholar wrote in 1642, the pestilence, we don't know what, the pestilence arose again on a large scale, affecting 8 or 9 of every 10 households. In a household of 10 or 20 people, all would be afflicted, and often all would die. At first, the bodies were buried in coffins, and next in grasses, but finally they were just left in the places where they died. In one big city in 1643, there was basically no signs of human life in the streets, only the buzzing of flies broke the silence. Those are quotes from Chinese observers. Very interesting, it was at this time in the 1640s that the Chinese, having experienced this massive disease, developed a new medical theory of disease, and epidemics based on qi. And you've all heard of qi, which is supposedly sort of the life force that's involved in acupuncture and everything. And their view was that there was this sort of non-material substance force, kind of like phlogiston in the West, and it had to be in balance. And when the qi on heaven and earth, there was qi in heaven and qi on earth, got disrupted, then plague and then chaos broke out on earth and people started dying of various diseases. And of course, you know, Americans have recently become wildly infatuated with Chinese medicine and the qi theory of things and acupuncture. And we can talk a lot about that privately if you wish, but the point is it did not help the Chinese at all. You can see the medical statistics, again, as far as we have them, And up until recent times, from the practice of acupuncture, you don't see any form of disease lessened at all. And the only thing you see in China and Japan also is a tremendous rise in hepatitis because of the transmission from the needles, because they didn't understand anything about sterilization. Okay, and then these plagues caused enormous political changes, just as in Europe. So the Ming Dynasty, for instance, fell, possibly as a result of the depopulation and chaos of the plague, and that allowed the Mongols to come in and set up their own dynasty. I'm sorry, the Manchu from Manchuria, the Manchu to come in and set up the Qing dynasty. And similarly to Europe, after one of these decimations of the population, good land became available and people moved into the good land, and they had a blossoming of wealth and culture even for the peasants. And it's a cycle not very different than what Malthus talked about, balancing the relationship between the number of people and the amount of land available. Throughout this whole period, life expectancy was very poor. We have scattered statistics. So a village in the 1790s showed that 1/3 of male children died in their first year of life, and half of them died before they were 20. And the female situation was comparable, but probably worse because of infanticide. So they're probably counting only those that got through the period of infanticide. Life expectancy was 32 in this particular village, and only 4% of the population lived past 65. And again, it's not terribly different than what we saw in the statistic, the graph for Cisalpine Gaul, where about a third of the women are dead before they start their reproductive life. But when the Ming came to power, there was still land, unoccupied land available. As Malthus said, the best land was already used for agriculture, but there was less good land still available. And under the Ming, the population grew. We're talking 1600s into 1700s. The Ming, I'm sorry, the ends in the 1650 or so. And the population grew. What did the people do? They moved on to the marginal land, and that meant higher into the mountains, on trying to farm on steeper slopes. They cleared forested areas. They moved into dry areas. And the result of all this was enormous soil erosion, that especially on the mountainsides and the dry areas. The productivity dropped because this land is just not good. And the erosion, the forest couldn't hold the water anymore. The period of China's always had floods. It's a big part of Chinese history. But these really massive, massive uncontrollable floods date from this period where the population increased and people started going into areas where it's ecologically very unstable, cutting down the forests, and then when it rains, you get these enormous floods. And also the floods not only but they devastated the agriculture in the lowlands. So you not only had a poorer agriculture per capita in the highlands, but you also reduced the per capita farming in the lowlands. Again, population growth can make it difficult for everybody. So again, like Europe and like Africa, American foods, when they were discovered, went into China because they, as I said, have something like twice the caloric content of anything except rice. If you can grow rice, rice is as good as potatoes, or just about as good. And so China picked up sweet potatoes especially, peanuts especially, some white potatoes, and they doubled food production. And guess what happened? The population doubled. So again, the introduction of these foods and the tremendous improvement in agriculture didn't help the per capita eating, the per capita amount of food for individuals. And during this same period, as people increased, one farmer could grow more land, but the people that could eat needed more land for themselves, so they moved again out. And the land under cultivation increased by a factor of 4.5 times. But again, during this sort of second round of population growth, one is after when the Ming take over, and one is after American foods are introduced. The erosion becomes extreme. And it's so extreme that by 1978, about one third of all arable land in China had to be abandoned because of erosion. So it's an enormous problem in China. And so this is really, China experienced Malthus, what I call Malthus with a vengeance. So this is the cultivated, oh, we still didn't find it. Ah, there it is, there it is. Okay, so this is cultivated land, and you can see that here, 1700 or so, basically American foods come in, and you can plant stuff everywhere, and the amount of land under cultivation goes up like crazy. Some of this decline is very recent, is industrialization, cities growing, and some of it is erosion. So the land thing looks like an enormous increase in the amount of land available for farming, but here is the per capita amount of land, the cultivated land, hectares per capita, whereas this is simple hectares, and it grows, then it crashes, probably again to do with the Mongol invasions. There are just fewer people. I'm sorry, I probably have this backwards. It rises here, the land per capita, because you just get rid of the people. And then in the modern population growth, the land per capita just crashes down. And now this is 0.2 hectares, now we're 0.1 hectare per person, which is like a quarter of an acre, a very small amount of land per person. And of course the Chinese realized this as well as anybody, and it was a matter of official concern during the Ming and the Qing dynasties. And in 1790, just before Malthus wrote, a Chinese scholar and high government official, Hang Liangji, he started warning the Chinese about the difficulties that unchecked population growth would cause as it outraged Chinese productive capacity. That's the way he phrased it. So it's clear that the original understanding of China, that its population was pressing really severely against its resources, was accurate, but it still doesn't explain why was it in China that you got these incredibly dense populations. Why didn't that happen elsewhere, say in China or England? And so what jumps to your mind? Probably that they had very high fertility. They had no, in England we talked about the late marriage system and everything, which kept fertility down. And Americans generally have the image, and Westerners generally have the image of that the Chinese reproduce, have a lot of children all the time, like your grandparents or something. So, and this makes good sense in the Chinese culture. The principal goal of life was to produce sons, as you've heard over and over again, and this origin of ancestor worship, I think, as you just said, goes back at least to the 2nd and 3rd millennia BC. So 5,000 years, what Qing said is the scholarly number. And they did all kinds of things to get a son. Adoption was very, very common. You'll read about that in the reading if you haven't already. James Lee talks about very high rates of adoption. People who didn't have a son would get an adoption. And the filial piety, that they had a Confucian system, which I'll talk about in a moment, where the younger brothers, for instance, had to pay absolute obedience to the older brothers, and they all had to pay absolute obedience to the father. So if a younger brother had a son, and the older brother didn't, the younger brother had to give that son to the older brother. By modern times, that was the same situation in Qing's family. Of course, that strict Confucian thing doesn't exist anymore. But in the old days, it would always be the younger sons, no matter what the biological story was, it would always be the younger sons that did not have male children. And so in China, everyone was expected to marry, and they married very young in order to secure a bride, because, as I mentioned to you, I think with respect to the sex-selective abortion, traditionally China has always done away with 10 to 25% of its females. So there was always, not always, but as much as we have data. And so there's always been an excess of males, and a lot of, they can't get married. So they did all kinds of things to secure a bride for a son, and that included getting betrothed very, very young and starting reproduction as soon as puberty allowed. and it was made worse by the fact that it was quite acceptable for males to take second wives or third wives or fourth wives down into concubines. And every time one male had more than one wife, then some other male got no wife at all. Okay, so let's look. So one of the possibilities is, the obvious one, is China had very high fertility. And we'll see if that's true. So here's a bunch of data. And what this is the age of the woman, and they don't have much reproduction beyond age 40 in this sample, although modernly we would have. The age of the woman and what her rate is per, I guess, per 1,000 women. And you can see, so women start out at age 20 with a very high rate in all these curves with a high rate of reproduction. It either goes down a little bit by age 25 or sometimes in some places increases a little bit by age 25. And then as the woman gets older, fertility drops off. There's fewer and fewer children per year. At 40-year-olds just have fewer children than 20 or 25-year-olds. That's a very obvious kind of thing. Now, these are two different sets of population. This is data from one area of the world, data from another area of the world. One area is all of the data China with one line from Japan, and the other set of data is Europe, various European countries. And guess which is which? Some hands. I mean, a big difference in fertility. You think China's the one at the bottom?
One of the articles is talking about how a lot, like Chinese families, actually have low fertility because of marital restraint.
That's right. That's the Lee article. So we're one lecture behind, as you've probably realized already. And so the reading that you should do tonight actually gave away the answer. Yes, this is the European population. This is the Chinese population. So that the Chinese, once married, within marriage, in both places, extramarital fertility is not a big deal. So you can take this as general reproduction. But within marriage, the Europeans had a much higher rate of childbearing than the Chinese did. In fact, it's almost a factor of 2, from 200 to 300 to 400 to 500, that it was a lot. The Europeans, once married, once having access to sex, really had children uncontrollably, as one says, whereas the Chinese were doing something to control their births. And that was a shocker when this data came out, and it's fairly recent data, because the presumption from at least Malthus's time was that the Chinese just reproduced like flies or something, and that the Europeans had this wonderful restraint. And it turns out that's just the opposite of what is true. And it's very surprising given the cultural emphasis on reproduction by the Chinese. So one of the big issues now under discussion is whether this is a sign that the Chinese were consciously doing some kind of birth control, that they were consciously trying to limit their families, or whether it was one of these cultural things where the culture in some sense stumbles onto a practice and it makes that culture successful, even though the people have no idea what the purpose of it is. It may just be a sort of an artifact of culture, and they will think, the population will think this is due to their following God's rules or proper decorum or various cultural reasons. They will give you cultural reasons why they have few children and not understand that that's what makes the whole society survive. And James Lee, who is definitely the world's foremost demographer of China, he has no doubt, even though the data is not as solid as one would like, he has no doubt that it was infrequent sexual activity that led to the low birth rate. As a cultural thing, not as a conscious way of reducing fertility. And he describes a story where a young couple gets married and they're in what we perceive as the height of sexual desire, but their sleeping arrangements are they have there's a double-decker bed, and the young married couple sleeps above, and the grandmother is in the bed below, and the grandmother carries her cane to bed, and whenever upstairs hears things starting to go on, bang, 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 cut it out. And so that kind of thing, that the old people didn't go along with this. And the reason for this, I mean, as a Chinese would see it, is that the Confucian ethic, they don't have, it's not a religious thing at all. There's no sense of a deity or anything supernatural going on, but personal relationships are what's important. And they're a set of unequal personal relationships. A subject has to give absolute deference to the ruler, the emperor. Children have to give absolute deference to the parents and to elders. Women have to give absolute deference first to her brothers and then to her husbands, women to men. Younger brothers have to give absolute deference to their older brothers. And of these, the only relationship that's equal is friend-friend relationship. That's the fifth relationship. So you can be buddies with your friend, but you must be superior to your wife, and your wife must be inferior to you, and so you cannot be friends with them. Love or passion between a married couple not only didn't happen, it was not approved of. It was like you're being bad if you love your wife, if you have passion for your wife. That was a not good thing. And so husband and wife did not relate to each other as lovers or even as friends. And there's a very famous Chinese story where a young man had been married some years, is walking with another male friend with whom he can befriend and converse, and he's bemoaning his fate that here he loves his wife so extremely, but he can't express his love for her to her. He can't have walks in the moonlight like he's having with his male friend. He can't have this kind of a chat with her because that is against the morality and ethics of the system. So these cultural things, which I think no Chinese of the time would describe as, oh, that's the way we keep our population down, are what is the explanation for this, rather than some kind of conscious effort. Also, another factor that is not a conscious sort of thing is that Chinese married younger than Europeans. So when you do an age-adjusted thing, by 20, they had been married for several years, and there's what's called the boredom factor going on. And no matter what age a couple marry at, they have sex a lot in the beginning, and so if they're not protecting themselves, they have a high birth rate, and then it falls down. And some fraction of this difference here may just be due to the age of marriage. Yeah?
So why is the Chinese population so much more dense?
Yeah, so we're going to get to that. Actually, we may not get to it till next time. But that's still, again, we're pushing out. We still haven't explained why the population is more dense. And it's getting time. Let me just finish saying something about this 10 to 25% getting rid of the females, which again would reduce the population, would lead you to not think there was such a density. In the 17th century, again, this is from Jesuit missionaries to China, reporting back to Europe, they were horrified to find that in Beijing alone, Peking at the time, several thousand babies, almost exclusively females, were thrown into the streets like refuse to be collected each morning by carriers who dumped them into huge pits outside the city. And sounds very much like Europe of a similar time. And what's interesting is that right now China is approaching pretty much the same female, with the sex-selective infanticide, pretty much the same female deficit that's been, as far as we can tell, the traditional level of it. But now there's all this moaning and groaning about, all these unmarried males and how it will utterly disrupt Chinese society, and it's a horrible sort of thing. And also, I think I mentioned this before, as you've seen in Europe, where rather than 10 to 25% of the males not being able to get married because of the deficit of females, 40, 50, 60% of the males did not get married in Europe. I showed you the graphs of that when we discussed Europe. So the Chinese system, fertility system, which keeps their population manageable, not small but manageable, is moderately early, not extremely early, moderately early and nearly universal marriage of surviving females. In 1998, for instance, only 1% of Chinese women were unmarried by age 30, whereas in the West in that year, 15% were unmarried, 15 times as much, even by age 40 in the West. And so the European system was that only about half of everybody got married, but once married, they had births at about twice the rate of Chinese. In Chinese, all the women got married, but within marriage, they had a low rate of fertility. So you have to, you cut your fertility down by half, either by the European thing of less than complete marriage, or by the Chinese thing of less than complete fertility. So it looks like that fertility, the total fertility rates should be more or less the same between China and Europe, but by essentially opposite kinds of fertility systems. And we'll see, I'm sorry, next time we'll continue and we'll see what is one of the theories for why China got into the difficulties. It was not just uncontrolled reproduction. As they perceive it, population got so out of control that the government felt that they had to introduce such a draconian policy as this, such a stringent kind of policy. And the flip side of that coin is, why is China just now digging out from the abject poverty that the people were in when Europe and America dug out 200 years ago? I mean, England started, but all of Europe and America went through this phase 200 years ago. And why not China? Of course, this is a very, very hotly contested issue among historians. And the basic setup of the story is that in about 1800, when Malthus was writing, China was very powerful, very strong, very rich country, and the West was beginning to be that way. This is one family's experience, and as Ching says, it's quite different people. But what you should realize is that this is one of 300 million such stories. The stories may be different, but there's 300 million of them. That's what the Chinese government is now saying, that the one-child policy has averted 300 million births in China, that their population, instead of being 1.3 billion now, would be 1.6 billion. And that 300 million people is the total population of the United States. So China has, as they perceive it, as they claim, averted putting another United States worth of population into the world. And that's the significance of spending 2 full lectures on China, off of that to the reduction in fertility, that they didn't have to cope with so many children, and that's a cause of their economy taking off. So they perceive that the one-child policy has allowed China to emerge from this, grinding poverty that they were in and become a modern, at least start to become a modern nation in the world. Another story, another data set that I just recently came across had to do with carbon emissions. That at a world average of carbon usage, which is probably below what China's actually using, 300 extra million people would have produced 1.5 billion, that's a billion with a B, billion tons of CO2 each year. And that's more than the total CO2 production of an industrial giant like Germany. So if you're looking at this issue from an environmental point of view, the reduction of people and their environmental impact makes, again, a huge difference. And the Chinese, for instance, feel that because of the one-child policy alone, they have done more than any other country to ameliorate the environmental crisis. Okay, that's just a hint of the very difficult things. How do you weigh the story of a family and 300 million families, like you've just heard, against these sort of macro issues? And it is not easy. So, but the question I want to set up today, which is to go backwards, is this kind of policy happens only in China. This kind of enormous population, as the Chinese perceive it, overpopulation, happens in China, really, and in India in terms of massive stuff. And we've talked a little about India and South Asia. But the question is, what's special about China? Why did this happen in China? Why did China, and we could, of course, spend a lot more, is that China is just so big that everything that happens there has these tremendous significances, both on an individual personal level for each individual or family that experiences it, but also on the global level. 1 out of every 5 human beings lives in China, so it is very big. We'll talk in a later lecture explicitly about the one-child policy, but there's information I have to give you today to understand what it's about. But let me just say now that the Chinese government is, of course, well aware of the human and human rights sacrifices of the individual people, but they argue that the benefits outweigh the suffering. And so just to give you a little hint of the way the government thinks about it, and many other people in China, that the great economic boom that China has had, most economists now around the world attribute the kick